We're going to have to be more scrappy and competitive and attract lots of different companies of all shapes and sizes to locate here and make sure that the ones that are here today see themselves here 10, 20 years from now.
Well, those are some words of concern about our local economy here in Seattle from the Downtown Seattle Association. Now some of those concerns really coming into focus with multiple rounds of layoffs in the tech sector across our region. What impact will those job losses have on Seattle? Is there any bright economic news ahead? Plus, why is Seattle's brand new convention center worried about its future, even with bookings coming in at a record pace? And what's the city council doing to the permit review process? The answer might surprise you, or maybe it won't. If you're a listener to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast, nothing gets by you. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my friend and co-host, once again, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I wanted to lay this on you. I have had some frustrations recently driving around Seattle, mainly from what I see as drivers not paying attention. I came across some wonderful online commentary to describe the situation, wanted your feedback. So, agree or disagree? Angrily gesturing with exaggerated hand and shoulder movements teleports blame outside of your vehicle. Is that a Seattle driver quality, yes or no?
I don't know if it's a specifically Seattle driver quality, but that is one of my least favorite things is because I ride my bike a lot.
Yeah.
And every now and then someone will pull out in front of me and like come close to hitting me and they do this little wave as if it was like a friendly interaction when all I want to be is like mad about it. They were trying to apologize. So yeah, I've experienced that before. I don't know if it's specific to Seattle though.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. It's just the whole concept of pantomime. I've met a lot of people who say they aren't actors, but put them behind a wheel. It's a whole different story out there. All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. Patrons, thanks for helping out the program as you do. Allison, very much appreciate you jumping on as a free member last week. But we'd really like you to jump on board as a full-fledged patron of the program. You can do that for as little as $5 per month. What a deal there. You can get Patrons First podcast before anybody else. More of that coming real soon. Plus, a cool Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Giving levels start at just $5 per month. Check it out. Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks for watching the podcast as well on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get it going here. Time for Right Here, Right Now. The last 7 days or so, a lot of different news going on. Challenging time for Seattle, responding to multiple homicides. 2 teenagers shot and killed near Rainier Beach High School, plus 1 dead, 3 injured in a shooting at a parking garage in Pioneer Square. And on top of that, we've got some interesting economic news coming out from the state level. They're talking about a millionaire's tax. That's been formally introduced. We've talked about it on the podcast, a lot cooking there. But I did want to get with you, David, to some tough economic news, really specifically to Seattle. The layoffs are coming hot and heavy. There were 16,000 layoffs at Amazon last week. Nearly 2,200 of those were from the Seattle area. This is following layoffs in October, where nearly 2,300 workers were cut by Amazon. Overall, as reported by your colleague, Alex Halverson at the Seattle Times, tech companies have let go of almost 9,800 workers based in Washington since January of 2025. And I know we've talked about these layoffs before, maybe a correction after some pumped up hiring after the pandemic. But do you see this turning into a larger concern than that at this point, David? What are you seeing?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't know that it's there yet to what you were saying, which is that we are, I don't know exactly where it is, but I think we're still above where we were pre-pandemic. There was a lot of hiring that happened around then. And that is the message that the leadership of these companies are putting out there is, at least that's what Andy Jassy at Amazon was talking about was, hey, we really pumped up pretty hard around the pandemic, and this is kind of streamlining things and normal, nothing to see here was basically his message. Mm-hmm. And there's some truth to that, certainly. But, I think there are 2 major questions overhanging this, which is the first one is AI and what that means for Seattle, the Seattle area, because our economy is really heavily dependent on tech. And if AI is going to keep eating into that, that's going to be a problem for our local economy. The leadership, from what I've read, is downplaying that at this point. But, my colleagues talked to people who work there who told stories about spending their days training AI and having this feeling like they were training their own replacement. And, some, reporting about pressure on employees to lean a little more heavily on AI. So, I think it's starting to get to the point where it strains credulity to think it is not playing some factor in staffing decisions, even if it isn't quite yet at the level of like sweeping revolutionary changes. And then I think the other question mark hanging over the whole thing is um, political, tax policy basically,
Yes, right.
and politics of it. Um, of course, we're too early into Mayor Katie Wilson's term for her to, kind of shoulder any cause and effect here. But I
Mhm.
do think that is going to be a theme of the next 4 years is, um, as, as my colleague Danny Westney has written a lot about, the push to tax corporations and rich people as popular politically as ever. It wins at the ballot box. It wins um, people campaigns, and that was the case in Seattle. We have polling that shows it's pretty popular across the whole state. The question is that political popularity going to have some kind of downstream effect on economic viability for these companies? I think the fact that these two things are happening at the same time is going to
Yeah,
make it kind of at once sort of difficult to parse them apart, what the cause and effect of particularly the tax policy is,
yeah.
and allow a lot of people to essentially choose their own narrative.
Right. And I think this is something that's going on at the state level too. They're talking about a tax similar to Jumpstart at the Seattle level here. I mean, just in looking at the numbers here, most of the layoffs are still happening outside of Seattle proper. So,
Yeah.
how much does the city's push to tax larger businesses really have an impact on these decisions? I guess I'm trying to go to that next question though. Where does the city and region need to focus its attention to improve economic conditions? Because Danny Westmead was writing about this too. We have all these quote AI exposed jobs, which includes journalists, by the way, here. But
Yeah.
but I'm just trying to figure out what local government can do to try to respond to these bigger economic forces that are at play.
Yeah, it's a funny position to be in. There is some parallel to, say, the Boeing bust situation, which is that the region and Seattle in particular is kind of a company town. It's a industry heavy town, and that does put you in a fragile position. Of course, the two things are so vastly different because one was a manufacturing sector, and this is more the fact that we are so heavily on, I don't really know what the umbrella term is, but maybe kind of more
Software
intellectual.
services, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Between, the universities and the tech companies, and it's just a very uh, it's an economy built around a highly educated workforce.
Yeah,
Um, as it turns out, a lot of that workforce might be vulnerable to AI, and um, you hear stories about young people came up through high school being told they got to learn how to code and go off and be the next software engineers coming out of college and basically having no job prospects whatsoever. So, more than just the layoffs, I think there's just not a lot of inflow into this sector, into particularly the tech sector anymore.
right.
Um, and the data is already showing up. Seattle area unemployment is higher than national
Hmm.
inflation. Just all the economic indicators for Seattle and the Seattle area are largely worse than the national picture.
Yeah,
And I think most of it is because of that tech sector. There's, um, again, not to keep quoting Danny Westney, but he likes
sure.
that term prosperity bomb.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so I
yeah.
think I think there are probably actually going to be some people who don't entirely see this as a terrible thing, though economic contraction is always going to be uncomfortable and more complicated than I think some people would assume.
Yeah, that's for sure. I did want to talk about another interesting economic issue in Seattle right now. The health of the financial health, at least, of the newly remodeled convention center. New $2 billion center opened in 2023. It's had more business than it's had in a decade, but there's still a big concern over how much it had to deplete its reserves to get this project off the ground. David, I thought this was a really interesting piece, a deep dive story you did for the Seattle Times on this. What's going on with the convention center?
Yeah, so this came up, struck my interest because of as a lot of stories do actually, an offhanded remark in a city council meeting. Council President Sarah Nelson had made some allusion to the fact that people at the convention center had come to her several times asking for help. That stood out to me because we have
Hmm.
this brand new convention center. So, I spent some time talking to people there and looking at their paperwork. And, it's I don't want to overstate the current risk to the convention center. It's not like it's about to go bankrupt, but it is in
Yeah.
this situation that's very fragile, which is that like you said, it was building this brand new building right in the middle of the pandemic, and that really put it in a difficult spot. And as a result, they asked for government help, and in addition, they had about $200 million in reserves, and they spent pretty much all of that to keep the project moving and to finish construction. Um, Now, though, basically the worth of their entire campus is $3 billion, and they don't have any reserves, and that's a really precarious position to be in because a campus of that size requires constant maintenance, forward thinking, and so to not have any flexibility is a fragile place for them to be.
Mm.
Compounding that is, this new building is in fact drawing more people and attendees as it was
Yeah.
intended, but there are two kind of issues. The first is that it's just vastly more expensive to operate
Hmm.
as a result. So even though attendance is up, profits are not. So their net standing is still kind of on a downward trajectory.
Mm.
And then the other piece is, in some ways, this new building is so successful that they're having a hard time putting events in the old building.
Mm.
And that isn't, the whole point of this addition was so that they could run concurrent events.
Yeah.
But what they're running into is people don't really want to be in the old building when they can look across the street and see this brand new building.
Sure.
And so now they're saying, our next step is we need to put a lot more money into our old building, but they don't have any reserves to do that. And so it puts them in a position where basically they're treading water on a kind of shaky economic, financial portfolio. And, maybe if this was a restaurant, we wouldn't be too concerned about it. But this is not a restaurant. This is
Yeah.
the largest private project in the city's history. It takes up a huge amount of space right in the middle of downtown Seattle between Capitol Hill and downtown. And so anytime we hear the CEO saying, this is a little scary,
Hmm.
I think it's worth taking note.
Well, what's it going to take though to get the convention center on firmer financial ground? I know it's got a lot of people coming in. That sounds like a good thing. Is it more municipal investment? I know the city of Seattle doesn't have a ton of extra money to throw around here. What's it going to take for this project to get on firmer footing?
Yeah, so as I alluded to, the convention center leadership had approached the city council because there's a short-term lodging tax, basically a tax on Airbnbs and VRBOs, and they approached the city council and said, "Hey, would you think about diverting some of that money to us?" Those conversations never really got anywhere, and then the person they were talking to, Sarah Nelson, lost re-election. So those conversations are essentially dead.
Right.
They also had hoped that maybe the state could divert a little bit more money to the convention center, but we don't see any sign of that in Governor Ferguson's budget. There's no real conversation happening at the state legislature to do that. And so, at the end of the day, the only way out of this is you got to bring in more business.
Yeah.
That is, there are some questions about how robust the larger convention center circuit is. What people were telling me is, if you're a association, whatever the dentist association
Yeah.
of dentists or whatever,
Hmm. Hmm.
those events seem to still be kind of going forward because there's some economic benefit for those associations to do that because
Right.
they're trade shows and people
Hmm.
can recruit and
Yep.
network. It's the corporate events that are really not returning. And those are the ones where, say, Amazon has a big shareholders meeting or whatever it might be. Those events were never money makers. Those were always, they had to pay out of pocket to make those happen.
Mm.
And they had, once upon a time thought there was some benefit to them. They are seeing less benefit to that, particularly, considering all the conversations we just had about layoffs.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a little, the corporate world is a little more scared about the economic outlook. And so those events have really not followed. And so what happens is there are not maybe as many events broadly, and you've just got a ton of competition. There are cities that perhaps are not as economically populist, let's say, as
Mm.
Seattle, who are more than willing to dump billions and billions of dollars into their new convention centers. And as one analyst told me, it really is an arms race. So if you
Yeah.
want to win these events, you got to keep pouring money into it. But keep pouring money into it requires that the money is there in the first place
Yeah.
and political will.
Wow.
And so it's not that there aren't events out there. And again, attendance is going up, but it isn't going up at the level that they anticipated when they first set out to build this project.
Yeah, yeah. Boy, so interested to see what happens there. Thank you for that piece in the Times, David. All right, well, up next, a milestone ahead for Seattle's new voter-approved social housing developer. The money is coming in to fund this system. Now, where's that money going to go? The story next on Now Hear This. Seattle City Council is busy yet again with some legislation this week in committee, so not full council approval yet, on a deal to launch the city's cooperation with the social housing developer, voter-approved social housing developer. Finance Committee approved an agreement between the mayor's office and the social housing developer to figure out how the tax this developer is bringing in will be implemented and administered. Remember, this is revenue from a 5% tax on salaries over $1 million for employers doing business in Seattle, again, as approved by voters last February. So the city gave the developer a $2 million loan last summer to keep the business running. Now the dollars should be coming in from this tax, so the developer pays back that loan and goes about its business.
Colleagues, I'll just say this is an important step forward to make sure that we are getting the resources to the social housing developer to ensure that they have the funding in place to do the actions that they need to take over the next year to begin taking this from a vision to a reality in our city.
David, I just had a housekeeping concern about this off the top. Any worries about how this deal is going to work with a social housing developer that recently got rid of its executive director? What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, it's a precarious time, and I think the board members who voted to fire Roberto Jimenez, their argument was, if we're going to make a change, which we think we need to, now is the time to do it because this money's about to come in and we want to be in the best position possible. The flip side of argument to his defenders, of course, was why in the world would you change leadership right before we're about to get all this money? So, it kind of, I don't know the answer to that. It is worthy of paying attention to. Last I heard, there were something like 6 possible buildings that the social housing developer could move forward on. I think 2 of those would have been construction and 4 of them would have been purchases.
Right.
I don't entirely know how close to the finish line those were. But those were conversations and deals that Jimenez had gotten rolling on. So I think there is some question about can there be a seamless transition to Tiffany McCoy, interim CEO? Can she kind of pick this up and push those across the finish line in a transparent way? That'll be interesting. I frankly didn't hear as much concern about the state of leadership by the city council in that meeting that earlier today, on Tuesday. And I was a little bit surprised by that. I thought they would maybe want to hear a little bit more about, what does this mean that they just fired our CEO? I think there's some acknowledgement that, the city council has some role here, but it is technically an independent governing body. It had massive voter approval, so there's no conversation about anything that would look like cutting bait or changing course because, again, the political will was overwhelming. The voters spoke quite strongly that they want to spend this money on social housing. So I think a lot of people in City Hall are a little bit in a wait and see mode to see what this change in leadership actually means. That's certainly where I am. But I mean, this is not a small amount of money. This is like more money than most city departments get every year. And they're going to have to get it out the door pretty quickly because the worst thing I know it's not a nonprofit, but in some ways it functions a little bit like a nonprofit. And the worst thing that an organization like that can do is stockpile money. The point is to get it out the door and spend it. But, when you're talking about housing development here, that is about as complicated as it gets. I know that Tiffany McCoy has been pretty upfront about the fact that she doesn't have any experience in housing development and has said that she will bring in people who do. And there's some signs that has happened already. I can't remember her name, but they just hired somebody that I think is pretty well respected in the field. So, again, it's not going to be an easy task, but they will have the funds to do it.
Right. And I did want to touch on this idea. We brought this up a couple of weeks ago. So we've got all these affordable housing developers out there. They've run into the current economic climate so that their so-called affordable rents are actually higher than market rate prices. So there have been vacancies, sometimes buildings even put up for sale, these affordable housing structures. Can the social housing developer come in and grab those properties up? Would that be a good idea? Is that cannibalizing the system? Or I'm just trying to think of those I don't know, that low-hanging fruit out there in terms of actual structures that the social housing developer could take over and work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. My hunch, and I genuinely don't know the answer to that. I wonder if there would be some complicating factor because a lot of the buildings that the affordable housing providers are putting up for sale have either Section 8 or low income housing tax credit
Like that
covenants on
that
them.
tag is put
Um,
on them. Okay, yeah.
that tag is put on them, and that has to transfer with the sale.
Hmm.
And so basically, those buildings would have to be bought by another organization that is going to run them as affordable housing. And
Yeah,
part of the thing with the social housing developer is it's mixed income, that
that's
not
right.
everybody in these buildings. In fact, the financial model sort of depends on there being some people who are higher earners who are basically paying market rent or even maybe a little over market rent to
Yeah,
subsidize the rents for the people who don't earn as much in those same buildings. So
right. Up to
I don't think they can just,
120% area median income. Keep going.
yeah, exactly. But there were some buildings, and I'm thinking of Mount Baker Housing Association, which is an affordable kind of neighborhoody affordable housing provider. They had some buildings that they were just keeping subsidized out of like on their own. They didn't have the low income housing tax credit covenants tied to them. I think they had two buildings. Those were sold to, I don't know who, but they have been sold. So the social housing developer couldn't buy those. But
Okay.
if that kind of situation comes up again, where there are buildings that have been held at an affordable level just by the kind of mission of the organization that
Yeah.
holds them rather than any outside requirement, then yeah, I think that might be the kind of thing that they could go in and buy. Um, there's the city requires a kind of right of first refusal that,
Yes.
if you own a building that has rents at 80% AMI or less and you're going to sell it, you have to notify the city,
Yep.
which is actually how I got turned on to the sales of some of these
Ah,
affordable housing buildings.
yeah.
But that might be a research that maybe the social housing developer could tap into, which is, maybe older couples, older families that have been landlords forever and just for
Sure.
whatever reason haven't brought their rents up to market rate and they're going to
Hmm.
sell. And ordinarily, maybe a outside property management company or developer might buy them. Maybe in
Hmm.
that case, the social housing developer could come in and buy it. Um, so, it's again, but a lot of these buildings, sorry to keep going, but a lot of
Yeah,
these
yeah.
buildings are, it's not quite as easy as just buying a building and flipping it for social housing developer. I
Right,
mean,
right.
if there's a cheap building that is going on the market, there's probably a reason for that. A lot of them have enormous maintenance backlogs and would need a lot of money kind of dumped into it. Um, so, it's sort of like the office to housing conversion
Yeah, yeah,
conversation
yeah.
where it
Right.
sounds easy, but it's actually extremely complicated. There's a little bit of that aspect here as well. Roberto Jimenez would talk about that a lot. So yeah, I'll be curious. Again, it sounds easy to just buy these buildings. I think it's pretty complicated, but the fact that they have six on their radar, that's pretty good. That should be encouraging.
Yeah, yeah. We'll see what happens next there. I do want to touch on some related news this week from the world of real estate, if you will. The Seattle Times has reported that eviction levels in King County have hit an all-time high. Again, the number of eviction cases filed in courts around our state actually rose to 23,965 in 2025, a 3% increase from 2024. The increase was even bigger in the Seattle area. I guess this isn't a total surprise, David, as pandemic era dollars have truly run out, but still some alarming numbers there for me. And it appears 9 out of 10 of these cases are for non-payment of rent. What do those rising eviction levels say to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably still a bit of backlog that we're seeing because I was actually just reading a lawsuit, class action lawsuit, against Washington and a bunch of other, in Seattle and a bunch of other jurisdictions by landlords because of over the eviction moratorium, saying
Yeah,
basically they should have been illegal. I think there were these eviction moratoriums in place for a long time, and I think a lot of housing providers are starting to act on some of the tenants that they would have liked to evict before. I
yeah,
don't know how much of it is that though, because it has been a few years since those have been in place.
sure.
Um, there's and I mean, I think the fact is economic, as we talked about, the economic data isn't quite as good, so that probably plays a role here.
Hmm.
Um, I will point out that, eviction filings is not the same as evictions.
That's important. Yeah. Hmm.
There are a lot of resources for people should they end up in eviction court. Washington now guarantees you should have some legal defense
Yep.
if you're a tenant and facing eviction. There's a lot more rental assistance, which is actually kind of the agreed, like the preferred solution for a lot of
Both sides.
landlords
Yeah.
too. We don't actually like evicting people, so if there's rental assistance that we can bring people up to speed,
Yep.
then
Yep.
we would like to do that as well. And sometimes in order to get that rental assistance, you have to file the eviction to start. So again, eviction filings don't equal evictions, but when they go up, of course, there's going to be some correlation. So I think it's probably a hodgepodge of things having to do with just the fact that there really weren't evictions for several years there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really interested to see what happens over the next couple months and into this year in terms of where the rental market shifts in our region, because I think rents have stayed relatively flat. So we'll see where that goes. There's a lot still ahead with that. But then at the same time, I know the construction numbers are down too. So always interesting to see what's happening with land use here. And I'm going to keep on talking about it because the Seattle City Council is talking about it. They're doing what they can to get more housing into the pipeline. I want to talk about their efforts to change environmental requirements and a lot more coming up on What's Next. Well, David, the Seattle City Council is looking at two major issues in its land use committee this week, revising when and to what extent environmental review is part of a permit application process, and also looking at when and how transportation analyses are required for a project. I want to talk about this. What's the council after with this legislation? Where do you see it going with a new council in 2026? Because I know this idea was really brought up late last year.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that a lot of environmental review processes that were put into place, while well intentioned at the time, have been very effective in preventing a lot of housing from being built because it requires a lot of time and energy and money, and it's pretty easy to trigger environmental review, but very difficult to work through it. And so the idea is if you roll back some of the environmental review, it's not like we're talking about dumping chemicals into
Sure.
the Duwamish River or anything here. And this is
Right.
a lot of this was a lot of environmental review is looking at sort of like a lot of hypothetical effects on surrounding environment. And it's just a very kind of convoluted and in some ways subjective process. So I think the idea here is you streamline it a little bit and then you bring on more housing more quickly at a time when the city really needs it. I think this council is going to be more amenable and open to that, and I think this mayor is going to be not that Mayor Harrell was not open to that, but I think Mayor Wilson understands that she's made big promises on affordability and has also drawn a connection between the speed with which we build housing and the city's ability to be in a more affordable place, and so I think she's going to be supportive of changes like this. This council, there were some council members in the past, I think of Kathy Moore in particular, who was a little more skeptical of the relationship between housing supply and housing affordability. She's no longer on the council. This one is a much more, let's say, urbanist bent to it. So I think that's where we're coming from.
Yeah, and just a quick touch on this because we're in phase 2 of the comprehensive plan, in case you didn't know it, folks. So this year, the council is really going to be looking at perhaps more of these neighborhood centers, which Harold had originally removed, and then they might be put back in. There's some more upzones scheduled for the end of this year, too. Just a last touch on that. Where do you see that conversation going, David? Is it going to be a push for more density from this council, from the mayor? What do you think?
I would think so. I mean, she's said as much on the campaign trail, which is, that the city really likes to plan in pockets. Let's say, we have urban villages, and now we have neighborhood centers, and then we have transit-oriented development, and it's, we allow density, but it has to be in these very specific places. The mayor, that's changing because of, now there's more density allowed in formerly single-family zones, but Mayor Wilson has talked about, basically wanting to take what is now transit-oriented development and expand the boundaries out a little bit further. So more density further away from, because a lot of times what transit-oriented development actually ends up meaning is big apartment buildings on places like Aurora that are kind of unpleasant and polluted and dangerous.
Right.
So she has said at least that she wants to look at moving those boundaries a little further away from those big corridors. This particular proposal that's going to work through council has none of that. I mean, it has big changes, but this is not her proposal. This is
it's true.
Essentially Mayor Harrell's bill. It's even still is called the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. The Harrell administration or the Wilson administration basically made the calculation that if they had tried to make any big changes to this, it would really just delay it a lot and
Yep.
kind of get in the way. And so they
Yep.
said, whatever, we'll pass this as written, and then we will enact our agenda in steps 3 and 4, which are supposed to happen later this year and 2027.
Got it. Got it. Interested to see what happens there. We do need to wrap up, though, David, and I wanted to touch on this with you. I know it was Groundhog Day on Monday. Apparently, Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow, so we will have 6 more weeks of winter. Nobody told Mother Nature in Seattle because we have temperatures up around 60 degrees this week. I remember covering this many years ago when I was working at Q13, now Fox 13. The city of Snohomish has its own, or had its own, Ground Frog Day. Like they're actually tracking it. It ran through 2024, but that's no more, unfortunately. So it had me thinking here, does the Pacific Northwest need its own weather prognosticating animal? And if so, what should it be? What do you think?
Yeah, maybe it could be like a gooey duck or something. If the
There you
gooey
go.
duck squirts, then
Yes,
you could have 6 more weeks of winter or something like that.
I like it. Trust the bivalves. They know what's
Yeah,
going on out
exactly.
there. That's for sure. David, thanks a million for joining me once again. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics if you'd be so kind. Become a patron and support the show. Head to Patreon, online, find Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thanks for the support. Thanks also for listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever you are tuning in, including other countries. Taiwan, our top downloader from abroad last week, knocking off Germany from the top spot. Nice work. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. All right, great. We're big in Taiwan, dude. What can I tell you? Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright